Hi there, this is Catherine Dubberly, the Answer Lady. Today we're going to talk about casting on with some of the most common and easiest methods. First we'll do the E-wrap. The E-wrap gets something that behaves like a stitch on every needle so that you can start off your knitting. It has some advantages in that it's quite stretchy and it's quite easy to do. It's called the E-wrap because you make it as though your yarn was drawing the letter E around each needle. Normally, the E-wrap is worked from left to right, beginning on the far left needle, making loosish letter E's around all the needles to the right, moving to the right, that is. This is the case if the carriage is resting at the right, so as to begin your knitting by moving the carriage from right to left. Should you find that the carriage is on the other side for some reason and you want to E-wrap, as might happen when you're increasing, or it might happen if you just prefer to knit that way, particularly if you're left-handed, you would need to work your E-wraps in reverse, making E's backwards across the needles, moving from right to left. The classic way of starting off is by hanging a slip knot on the first needle. But there is an alternate way. I sometimes fold my yarn around the needles, and the first few stitches, that is the first few needles, will receive two pieces of yarn wrapping around them. In effect, this weaves in the yarn tail at the same time as you cast on. There are some limitations to the process, wonderful as it is. If using very thick yarn, it's not a good idea. It will make the first row very difficult to knit and give you a stiff, bumpy place in the cast-on. But when using a yarn that knits in the middle of the dial, it's often a wonderful thing to do. There are some variants on the E-wrap that will make a stretchier edge. These would be used where you need the knitting to be able to expand a great deal. One example is tuck stitch, as we all know that tuck stitch tends to get wider than it appeared while it was knitting, so we need the cast-on to match it and to be able to relax from left to right. The first of the variants is the double E-wrap. We begin on the left or rightmost needle as usual, and then instead of making letter E's around each needle, we make them around each pair of needles. Under 2, over 1, pull it through the first. Under 2, over 1, pull a loop through the first needle. It's really the same process, you're just using the needles to space it wider. This is also the case with the triple E-wrap, which is wide as I ever have a needle. The double and triple E-wrap have another advantage over the single E-wrap, in that they get the bunchy part of the yarn down and away from the needles sooner than if you were using the plain E-wrap. Normally this is not a problem. Most machines will knit from E-wrap and begin knitting beautifully, but occasionally a yarn is bumpy or fuzzy or in some way difficult to start off with, and it helps to use the double or triple E-wrap, which gets a true stitch on each needle before you begin knitting. It gives you a little bit more to hang your weights on if you need to hang your weights. We should mention here a couple of things about knitting with hobby machines versus knitting with metal bed machines. Now, I know that Passap machines may look as though they have plastic beds, but they are not to be considered hobby machines. They are serious machines, and they have some casting on challenges if using the E-wrap just because of the way they're constructed, but that's another subject. I am speaking of the LK150, which is the high end of the hobby machine. Then there's an HK100 and an LK100 and bond machines, and in the past a great many plastic bed machines were made. The majority of them will not automatically knit needles back from E position as the higher end machines will do. It's not a problem, it's just that you have to put those needles into upper working position to get your hobby machine to knit off your E-wrapped needles. Another really nice cast-on is the chain stitch cast-on. This is done around the needle shanks. I especially like this cast-on because it's a little bit less stretchy, which also makes it more stable than the E-wrapped cast-on. And it gives a very tidy, neat chain stitch along the lower edge of the fabric, so that you can match that to chain stitching a bind-off and get a perfect match beginning and ending. Wonderful for something where both will show, a dishcloth or a scarf or something like that. Plus, I just like it. It looks tidy. You can hold your hand using the latch tool either above or below the needles. Naturally, I'm going to work below the needles so that you have a hope and a prayer of seeing what it is that I'm doing. Begin with your slip knot on the latch tool. Wrap the working yarn around the needle and pull a loop through with the latch tool. This is exactly like making a chain in crocheting, except that we are making our chain around the row of needles. Be sure to pull your chain loose enough that it won't restrict the knitting or be difficult to knit through. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but once you are used to it, it can become very fast and very even, exactly like when you were learning to crochet. At first it seemed impossible, and now you can probably do it in your sleep. A moment ago, I said that you wrap yarn around the needle to make the crocheted cast-on, and I want to clarify that a little bit. It's not wrapped around as the E-wrap is. It's more that the yarn that you're working with travels above the needles as your hand travels below, and the composite of the two hands needs to encircle the next needle as you go. So there's no time that you take a piece of yarn and wrap it around. Now a couple of thoughts about using these cast-ons on Passap machines. They are not the classic way that Passap taught us to cast on, and although I love the Passap cast-ons, sometimes I want to use these as well. We have feeding eyelets on our Passaps, so pull your cast-on yarn through the feeding eyelet so that you'll have a continuous working yarn after you cast on. Second, because cast-ons on the Passap were not really designed to be done in this manner, I often find it far simpler to start with waste yarn using any classic easy cast-on for Passap, then a ravel cord, and then do my E-wraps, because it gives you something to pull down with, basically. Passaps weren't designed with knitting straight back from these cast-ons in mind. Also, they will not, under any circumstances, knit back from what we call E position or all the way forward position on a Japanese machine. You have got to put the needles back into their normal position. So, if you use a plain E-wrap, knit one row manually. This would mean you would probably knit or do your E-wraps from right to left, then do your first manual row from left to right, so as to end up in the normal starting position for Passap knitting. Obviously, this gives a great advantage to the double and triple E-wrap for casting on with Passap, because you end up with the needles in normal knitting position. Repeating, do not accidentally try to knit back from E position on a Passap. You will be very sorry. Nothing but sorrow and disaster will ensue. Other than that, these still make a great edge on Passap knitting, just as they do on any other knitting, particularly for single bed designs. Here are a couple of notes about casting on. First, you see me working with a yarn larger than I would normally use on this machine. The whole point of this is to make it easy for you to see, not to suggest that this is a good yarn to knit with on this machine. The second is, every now and then when I'm demonstrating a cast-on, somebody says, "Oh, I thought that was called such and such." Well, maybe it is. There is not a right and a wrong name for these. As far as I know, there has not been a divine statement to that effect. I've named the cast-ons what I learned them as, and other people learn them as different things. No big deal. Also, when people invent a cast-on, they name it what they want, of course. So you might have run into this taught under another name or doing it slightly differently. It's not wrong, and it's not necessarily better or worse. Use the way that's working for you.